And the biggest problem is the stock market. Right now, the richest 1% own 54% of all stocks. That's up from 40% in 2002. The idea of the stock market is that we're all supposed to participate, right? You can grow your wealth two ways. You can either get invested, get into the stock market, get ownership, or you can own property. Houses, other things, property. You got to own something to grow your wealth. That's what it means to grow wealth. You have to grow your assets. We're heading towards a scenario, if this keeps going, where average people don't get to own stock.
I was bringing up that toxins in our environment could have been a pretty big issue that, pointed to causing these things with physical sickness and mental health illness. And as I was talking about that, you pointed out that you asked me, Royal, do you think that's the first cause of this, or do you think there's an underlying cause causing these toxins in the environment and causing these harmful practices we have in society? You basically asked me, do you think that's the biggest problem we have right now? I'm like, I think it's a pretty big problem. You're like, well, I think there's something bigger. I think something's causing these things. And I asked you, what's the underlying cause of all this? And what did you say?
It's unchecked capitalism. Everything that happens in our environment that's perceived as a negative, I genuinely believe so much of it comes from when people have profit as their only goal. They're willing to justify all kinds of things, and we'll get more into that, but that's the main thing. It's unchecked capitalism with no regulation.
Well, that's a good podcast. I think we just wrap it up here, and
that's it, guys. That's the whole point.
Go ahead.
No facts, no data, just conjecture.
Just like Socrates did it. The way that you sparked this conversation initially with me a few months ago was you pulled up a stat, and I'm going to read it off right now. I had it written down so I can word it well, but you basically said since 1970, the GDP of America has doubled. And I'm like, okay, I can believe that. That makes sense. But then you followed up saying, however, the relative income for a regular family, adjusted for inflation, has remained the same since 1970.
Right.
And actually, I'll reward that. That's not exactly how it went. You told me that the GDP for the country has gone up double since 1970. And I pushed back. I said, there's no way. There's no way that's possible, because you're telling me that all the people living paycheck to paycheck now have double what people had in 1970, adjusting for inflation. And that's not possible. There's no way. Because that means in 1970, everyone would have been starving to death. But you told me after this, you're like, you're right. That's so true. GDP has doubled. However, relative income, adjusting for inflation for the average family, has stayed the same. And that blew my mind. I said, how's that possible? How can GDP double but our income stays the same? And what did you tell me?
I mean, it's just simply that most of the increase in per capita income is going to the top 1% and the top 10%. There's disproportionate figures there, right? The top 1% is pulling in more even than percentage 2 through 10. But that group of people is getting almost all of the increase, while regular average Americans are seeing none of it.
Wow.
Yeah. And to your point, I think there's a bit of a, it doesn't seem like it some days. Because, well, a lot of people are fine. They're doing fine, right? Mm-hmm. It seems like they're doing fine. But there's a bit of a frog in the boiling pot effect happening. And that's where you have to be able to parse the data and understand this picture on a bigger scale. So It's funny that you started this way too, because I had a conversation like, it's a few years back now, where a friend of mine, you know, a typical social liberal, right? Somebody in the LGBTQ community, and have all the typical social liberal beliefs that you would expect from somebody who's socially liberal. They are pro-choice, right? Big on LGBTQ rights and race inequality. Like, those are the kind of issues they like to talk about repeatedly.
Yeah.
And what I brought up, you know, do you realize how much negative impact is happening on the LGBTQ community because of wealth inequality, not because of just, it's easy to look at the president and be like, you should do different laws. It's easy to look at Congress and be like, why is it like this? It should be like this. And you can talk about that and be passionate about it, and that's great. But if more people just had economic freedom, many of these things wouldn't even require a particular law necessarily to even make that better. They would have that economic mobility to get themselves to a better place. And her response to me, I'll never forget it, was basically like, why is that always what you want to talk about? Economics is boring. Like, I don't like to, like, that's not the kind of politics I like to talk about. I like to talk about the fun stuff, because it's fun and easy to talk about social issues and toxins in the environment and conspiracy theories about this thing and Boeing knocking off people left and right, apparently. And, you know, those are the fun things. Economics is dirty.
Because it's so much simpler to point it as a good guy, bad guy narrative than a complex, you know, hard to complete math equation of, man, if we could, you know, distribute money in a different way, people would live their lives a lot better.
Yeah. Well, and even coming to that conclusion, economics is complicated, messy, dirty, massive, too big to wrap your head around. We can't even understand the concept of a billion. That's why there's people on TikTok and YouTube who make those little, like, this is your car in rice, and this is how much it would be compared to this billionaire's worth. Here's you buying your car. And they do it with, like, grains of rice. And then there's this huge, like, pile of, like, a whole tub full of rice, and then it's like taking that one out. That's this billionaire buying a car. And it's because that's the only way we can wrap our head around it. You know? We, like, just saying the numbers, it is hard to wrap your head around. It's not very fun sometimes. But what if? What if it's the biggest problem? And what if it is the first cause that causes most of our other societal issues? And that's what we can explore right now.
Interesting. I think let's play devil's advocate at the beginning here. I think anybody who hears that GDP for the country has doubled, but income adjusted for inflation has stayed the same for the bottom 90% of Americans, anybody can easily agree that that's bad, that's not good. That's hard to justify. The only devil's advocate I would say to that is people would say, how's that true? Is that actually true? Can you prove that? And I guess I don't know what the actual devil's advocate argument would be of why that would be good either. Like, that'd be a hard to justify.
I can give you the one I hear most often.
Okay.
The one I hear most often is that all boats are rising. Because that's sort of somewhat true, right? As overall economic access gets better. I've heard Ben Shapiro make the point a couple of times where he's like, well, yeah, but you didn't have an iPhone in 1970, and you didn't have this, and you didn't have that. Okay, fair enough, man.
Okay.
Sure, we have a few nicer things. Technology has gotten better. That's not really the point. If per capita income has doubled since 1970, I should be able to consume the same and work half as much, or work the same and consume double what I used to. And I can't do that, period. And that's like the frog in the boiling water pot. It just seems like, oh, sure, we have some nicer things. Everyone's got a nicer television set. You know, everyone's got an iPhone and access to some better technology. Okay. But what could I have had if things were balanced and things were fair that I'm currently being held out of?
I think.
And
Go ahead.
And there's some that's hard to parse. It's hard to really know.
I think it's funny that that's an argument used by them, or like someone like Ben Shapiro or whatever, because you having an iPhone doesn't feed you. It doesn't protect you from financial ruin. It doesn't protect your family from going hungry. Because at the end of the day, I see homeless people with iPhones, and that's not changing their life in any really good way. So just because we have better washer and dryers and amenities doesn't mean that life is actually better. I'd argue there's many people out there who had a in other times, other countries, or anywhere, that had a stable income, a predictable income. They had a secured future, per se, where they knew they had a really just good shot. And they are arguably 10 times happier, healthier than someone who is paycheck to paycheck but has an iPhone and a fridge with a screen on it.
Right. And there's more stats. There's more stats that make this picture even bleaker, because it's not just about average Americans. It's what do we define as fair, and how does that look? Because the per capita income, having all of that wealth growth go to the top 10% is a huge problem. But just how big of a problem is it? Just since 2020, billionaire wealth is up 88%. We went through a pandemic. Oh, God. You and I were struggling. Sure, we got a couple nice handout checks. Does anybody think that $1,400 here or $1,800 there from the government, whatever those checks were, any comes anywhere close to beating 88% billionaire wealth growth?
No.
No shot in the world. At the turn of the decade, in 2020, the top 10 billionaires only had one guy who had a net worth over $100 billion. That was Bezos. Now all 10 of them do.
Could you say that that's from inflation or literally just wealth siphoning?
It's wealth siphoning. It's 100% wealth siphoning. They took advantage of the unfortunate truth about COVID policies was that it ended up in the end being probably the second biggest transfer of wealth from poor people to rich people since the bank bailout under Obama.
Wow.
And that's just in the last 4 years. I mean, you go back to 1970, right? There was a time when the poorest person on the Forbes richest 400 list had a net worth of $220 million. Now to get into that club, you have to have $2.77 billion.
Wow.
So that's going from 82 to 2022. In 40 years, the richest 400 people in our country have just absolutely exploded, and the average member of the Forbes 400 has over 10 billion in total wealth, 15 times the 1982 average after adjusting for inflation.
Now,
and the biggest problem is the stock market. Because the idea of the stock market is that we're all supposed to participate, right? You can grow your wealth two ways. You can either get invested, get into the stock market, get ownership, or you can own property. Houses, other things, property. You got to own something to grow your wealth. That's what it means to grow wealth. You have to grow your assets. And right now, the richest 1% own 54% of all stocks. That's up from 40% in 2002. We're heading towards a scenario, if this keeps going, where average people don't get to own stock.
Let me ask you this, because I think it's really easy to paint billionaires as bad guys because they have a lot of money, almost in a classic Disney-esque Robin Hood style of a big fat rich cat on the top of the hill, A common argument I hear is when you say Bezos has 100 billion, Bezos doesn't actually have 100 billion. That's his net worth in terms of he couldn't go and spend 100 billion dollars right now if he wanted to, because that's not liquid money in his bank. That's net worth of all of his business assets, whatever. And frankly, if he did spend that, then I feel like more than $100 billion of business would go, a market would disappear, and that wouldn't help people, or would it? So tell me, how do you address the argument of that's not his liquid money that he can spend if he wanted to?
So two ways. Yeah, I don't care if the money's liquid or if it's in his assets. Point is he's got it and other people don't. So that's the most important thing to remember. It's like, okay, sure, he can go turn that into cash. He can do a lot of things because he has it. He can take loans against it. I mean, the average day for Bezos, compared to everybody else in this country, what he could do with the money he has available to him is just unbelievable. He has enough, probably in liquid assets, that you could go take probably about $100 million out of his bank account, and probably he would not notice or experience a single material change in his day-to-day life. I mean, his net worth fluctuates more than 100 million every couple of minutes.
Right.
So, that's the first piece. The second piece is to address the more important issue of, if he took all that business away, what it would do to the economy. I'm not sure he's done anything good for the economy.
Really? Amazon?
I mean, yeah. I mean, if you really think about Amazon and what it's doing for our life, I'm not sure it's a positive on the economy to single-handedly drive retail stores out of business everywhere. And that's what they're doing. And that's a part that is not factored. There could be an argument that that's good to centralize and concentrate that. Maybe retail stores were a bad thing. But if you look at how much Amazon has grown, unfortunately, it's just impossible to measure that against how much retail has collapsed. But we literally have something going on that we call retail Armageddon. Go to a mall. See how it's going.
Mm-hmm.
Go to any local mall. I mean, we have one mall where I live that's doing okay. The rest of them are in shambles. The rest of them are not making money. I, at one point, was a retail store manager in a mall where I was the only store open in an entire circle. The big anchor store had closed. Every other little store around us had closed. And we're just there like, when are we next? It's not good for the workers. It's high stress and anxiety. Retail workers are one of the biggest job sectors in the country. So if all of those people are losing their jobs, Amazon is not employing that many people. And so all that Amazon has really done is concentrated all of the profit that used to get distributed amongst retail workers across America and concentrated in basically one guy's hands. I don't think that's good.
He figured out how to do it for cheaper, charge the same amount, and then pay the workers less and keep the rest for himself.
Yes. And I mean, look, we all use Amazon.
Yeah.
I use it. No hypocrisy. You can't, when something's that big, you can sit there and be like, you hypocrite. It doesn't really get you anywhere, because the point is to compete. You're in capitalism too. You've got to be smart economically. You've got to be smart with your time. You've got to be smart with so if Amazon's the best choice for your product, you're just going to use Amazon.
Yeah.
But I do that knowing that I think this is ultimately a net drain on society. I don't think anybody wakes up going, I'm really glad I live in a world with Amazon.
Yeah.
If you really think about it, and you take the cost of what Amazon's doing to us, and all those people who are out of work and their stores are closed and they can't make any money, and all the little shops, I mean, good luck opening a family-owned retail business. There's no shot anymore.
When you say there's no choice but to use Amazon, and people would say, well, you use it because it's the best choice, and because it's the best choice, it has a right to exist. Is that good?
A right to exist. There are markets that we have banned since the dawn of time, and because we agreed that it didn't have a right to exist. And if this one places economics and profit over human beings, then it's in that category. And that includes the slave market. That includes the market over toxic substances, right? There are things that we have massive controls over, massive regulation over, where we decide this is not a market that's good for profit to be a motive for. And like, that's all that people like myself who argue for a much more regulated economy, we're basically just saying there's a lot more things that should fall under the umbrella of maybe profit isn't the right motive for this type of thing. I think that all weapons of war should be in that category. I think that health should be in that category. Well, hey, look, hospitals are nonprofit. Okay. What about the pharmaceuticals and the medical device companies and the insurance companies, right? Like 80% of healthcare is for profit in the United States. You don't get a get out of jail free card by appealing to the nonprofit hospitals.
Makes sense. Okay, let's posit that it is true, that wealth has doubled, but it's all gone to the top 10%, and most of that on the top 10% has gone to the top 1%. What do you do about that? Was it unfair that they got it because they played by the rules of business? Or should they not have gotten it?
Yeah. Are billionaires evil? Damn it. No. They played, for the most part, they played fair. It was our system that allowed for this inequality to happen. I mean, if you're the billionaire that doesn't capitalize and doesn't take an advantage, if you don't become Jeff Bezos, on some level you're an idiot. And like, we should just acknowledge that, right? Because the other guy will. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of arms race is what actually makes capitalism drive production and make things boom sometimes, right? The problem is, again, it's how do we check that against, is there actual human value, an increase in human value going up because of the kind of things we make? What do you do about it? What do you do about it now is a complicated problem. There are lots of different solutions, but the answer that I give that makes conservatives who, may watch this cringe when they first hear it is, like, you straight up have to redistribute this wealth. You have to do it in a fair way. You have to do it in a metered way. You have to do it in a measured way. And you have to respect everybody involved, including the billionaires, because again, they don't deserve to just all of a sudden, hey, you've had your fun, now we're going to take everything away from you and ruin your lives. And I don't think anybody would argue for that, but a lot of people would accuse me of arguing for that. But we have to start creating systems of incentives that claw back that wealth away from them. And you can do that through taxes. You can do that through just growing the bottom up. There's a lot of different ways.